안녕하세요. 오늘은 전 세계에서 비트코인으로 가장 유명한 사이페딘 아모스 강연을 가지고 왔습니다. 강연 주제는 스테이블 코인이 비트코인 가격에 미치는 영향에 대해서 다루었습니다. 강연 전에 간단하게 제가 요약을 해보았습니다. 이미 스테이블 코인에 관심이 많은 분들은 알고 계시겠지만 스테이블 코인은 전 세계적인 현상이 되고 있습니다. 스테이블 코인은 단순히 디지털 화폐의 전성기를 만들 뿐만 아니라 비트코인 가격의 엄청난 상승을 불러올 촉매제입니다. 그 이유로는 첫 번째로는 테더나 서클 같은 스테이블 코인사는 자사 코인 가치를 유지하기 위해서 미국채로 많은 자산을 유지할 수 없기에 지속해서 비트코인을 살 수밖에 없다고 합니다. 두 번째로는 비트코인 시장은 현재 매우 작기 때문에 조금만 자금이 유입되어도 비트코인은 큰 가격 상승을 일으킬 수 있다고 합니다. 특히 국채에 대한 불신이 커질 것이므로 비트코인에 대한 수요는 꾸준히 있을 것입니다. 이는 비트코인 가격에 매우 긍정적일 것입니다. 테더사 같은 스테이블 코인사는 국채와 비트코인을 비중을 계속 조정해서 가져갈 것입니다. 셋째로는 현재는 달러 기반 스테이블 코인으로 운영되지만 추후에는 달러 가치 감소로 미국 국채도 가치가 감소될 것입니다. 이로 인해 지속 패깅 비율을 조정할 것이고 미래에는 달러 기반 코인에서 비트코인 기반 스테이블 코인으로 변경될 것이라고 합니다. 이는 비트코인에 대한 수요가 지속적으로 그리고 아주 강하게 있을 것을 예견합니다. 그렇다면 자세한 강의 내용을 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
Today I'm going to be talking about Bitcoin and the dollar, in particular about Tether. And a lot of people think that Tether is going to be something that is very bullish to the dollar. And you know, to be fair, they found a whole new generation of bag holders around the world to buy the treasury shitcoin. So you would think that that would generally be bullish. But I'd like to take a closer look at it and see how bullish it actually is. So let us run some numbers. Let's assume as a thought experiment, let's assume that Tether grows 100-fold over the next 10 years. That's a compound annual growth rate of 60% per year. So it gets to about a $20 trillion market cap by 2035. And now assume that they continue to put about 80% of their treasury and their backing of their notes into all maturities of US bonds. Currently, they're only buying short maturities, but assume they start buying across the curve, across the yield curve. And to try and estimate the impact that this would have on the budget, I've looked at the literature on the impact of purchases of bonds on the yields. So there's a lot of studies that have been done on what was the impact of QE, you know, when, say, if you buy 10% of the debt and you put it into what the impact would be on yields. So I think generally the literature says every 10% of the debt, if you buy 10% of the debt, you can bring yields down by 0.2 to 0.5%. But I'm going to assume 1%. I'm going to just have a maximum, most optimistic scenario in all of our assumptions here to try and see how this would work out. So you buy 10% of the debt and you bring the yield down by 1%. So if we assume this is the case, and then we project the impact on the US budget, well, currently the debt is about $37 trillion. The budget deficit is about $2 trillion. And so if we assume that the budget deficit, the debt, and the liabilities continue to rise at the same rate over the next 10 years, as they did over the last 10 years, we can project it into the next 10 years. And, you know, this is an extremely conservative assumption because it's assuming that the next 10 years are going to be as inflationary as the previous 10. And I don't think that that is a warranted assumption, but we're going to go ahead with it anyway. I think there's been a new normal since COVID, and I think this new administration confirms that the budget is going to just continue on the new normal level of spending that happened after COVID, and it's going to be different from what was taking place before COVID, which was relatively very fiscally and monetarily responsible compared to what's been happening since then. So, you know, looking now, we see Doge is seemingly not going to work. They're not going to be managing to bring down the budget by anything more than, you know, rounding errors. There's a bunch of wars coming up, likely. Israel wants more land, and, you know, they like more war. It's been a while since the US has fought a major war for So likely there's going to be another one. So if you project those things, likely the budget is going to get a lot worse over the next 10 years, plus also the tariffs and the impact that they'll have. So if we run these projections, we'll see that basically by buying a lot of treasuries, growing at 60% per year, as we see in this table here, we grow the treasuries of Tether by 60% per year, and we see that this is going to bring yields down, right? That's the way in which buying treasuries helps the US government in a practical sense. The more treasuries Tether buys, the lower the yields become. So we try and calculate this and try and project it onto 10 years from now. And basically, the most optimistic scenario, according to these assumptions that I've just presented, which are all basically erring on the side of becoming more and more optimistic, it reduces the debt by about $3.7 trillion, or 5.4% of the debt over 10 years. This is, I think, maybe the most optimistic scenario you could probably present for the impact that Tether could have on the US public debt. And in conclusion, basically, nothing stops this train, as Lynn Alden always says, and not even Tether. Tether cannot fix what a century of fiat democracy ruined. There's been a century of inflation, a century of debt, a century of liabilities piled up, and you're not just going to find an enormous number of bag holders that are going to be able to buy this. Ultimately, I think another point that is often ignored here is that a lot of the demand that is coming for Tether is displaced demand. A lot of it is coming from people who are giving up on financial instruments that would have demanded treasuries otherwise. In other words, when a currency collapses and people in that country start using Tether, they're decreasing the demand for treasuries by the central bank of the government whose currency has collapsed. So it's not entirely new demand. And even if it were entirely new demand, even if we assume that 80% of it, as we did in the previous example, we still see that the impact on the debt situation in the US is not likely to be significant. It's not likely to make a significant difference because the amount of budget deficit is enormous and it's continuing to grow, and the debt and the interest are continuing to grow, and it won't touch the entitlements, it won't touch the defense spending, and so therefore all of this new extra demand is not really going to make a big difference. It's ultimately no way to escape the inevitable fate of default, devaluation, or default by devaluation, which are essentially all more or less the same thing, that a lot of people who are owed a lot of liabilities are going to find out that they're not going to get what they want from them. So this is ultimately what I think is more likely. Yes, it can help the fiscal position of the US government that more and more people are buying Tether, but I don't think it will make that big of a difference. But where does that leave Tether? I think there's an interesting question here to ask, which is, what is the impact that is going to have on Tether, given that their reserves are being devalued or that they might default on? So devaluation is not a big problem for Tether because their liabilities devalue as well. When the dollar goes down, the value of their liabilities and their asset goes down, so that's not a big problem. The bigger risk for them, of course, is default. Default is the main risk, and in particular, could be that the US government defaults specifically on Tether's bonds. Specifically, after they buy a lot of bonds, the US government could just say, oh, well, somebody was involved in some criminal transaction with Tether, therefore, all of your bonds are canceled. They've done it with Russia. Maybe they'll do it with Tether again at some point. Now, Tether are smartly hedging against this and protecting themselves from this by doing the smart thing that everybody should be doing, which is buying Bitcoin. It's the smartest thing that anybody could do. So currently, Tether has over 100,000 Bitcoins, which is worth more than $10 billion. And their US dollar denominated reserves and treasuries are around 120 billion. So currently, they've got more than 10 times as much fiat as they do Bitcoin. However, if there's one thing we know about Bitcoin, it's that it has number go up technology. And if there's one thing we know about the dollar, it's that it has number go down technology. Now, one thing keeps going up, the other thing keeps going down. Inevitably, the thing that goes up is going to overtake the things that go down. And so, whether through default, devaluation, or both, Tether's Bitcoin reserves will likely eventually overtake its US dollar reserves. The ways in which we get there might be different, but as long as Tether keeps buying more and more Bitcoin, which they seem not to be stopping, and which seems to be a very wise thing for them to do, because it's the only way to protect themselves from devaluation of the dollar and default on treasuries. As long as they keep doing that, the value of their Bitcoin reserves is going to continue to go up, and likely it's going to overtake their US dollar reserves. Now at this point, something that the Tether fraudsters have said would happen might actually finally happen. You know, we've always heard the Tether is going to break the peg, and maybe it will happen in this situation, because ultimately the real risk for Tether, the riskiest part of their business, is the treasury bonds. Treasury bonds, which are usually presented as the safe haven, are actually the main risk for Tether. And so over time, as their bonds devalue, as their dollars devalue, their Bitcoins appreciate, and so therefore they will be able to break the backing of Tether with the dollar, but they would break the peg upwards. In other words, it would be possible for them at some point to revalue Tether upwards, and so to make it so that one Tether is redeemable for $1.02. And then they could keep doing that further and further. They keep revaluing it upwards as the dollar drops. So Tether becomes relatively stable coin while the dollar keeps devaluing. If they offered the world a dollar plus 2% per year, or 1% per year, that would be more attractive than the dollar for a lot of people. And so therefore, we enter into this cycle where Tether can increase its valuation, which is going to increase demand for Tether at the expense of the dollar, which is going to then increase the amount of Tether purchases of Bitcoin, which is going to drive up the Bitcoin price further. And the key thing here is that even though Tether puts only a small percentage of its reserves in Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is so much smaller than the US debt market, that impact on the Bitcoin market is a lot more significant than the impact that they have with the majority of the reserves going into the debt, the US government debt. So the US government has got some $37 trillion in debt, which is enormous. Bitcoin is only $2 trillion. So a tiny amount of money going into Bitcoin causes it to go up a lot more than the same amount of money going into the bond market. So Bitcoin price appreciates the more that Tether buys. That causes the Tether reserves to appreciate, and that then helps them revalue their currency further and further and further. And eventually, what we see is, because of the fact that Tether is accumulating Bitcoin reserves, it can effectively grow its way out of being a Bitcoin, of being a dollar stablecoin, into becoming a stablecoin that is backed by Bitcoin. It can eventually redenominate itself in Bitcoin terms, eventually making it so that it just becomes another mechanism for the scaling of Bitcoin. I think the key point to keep in mind is that the ability of Tether to prop up the debt market is extremely small, because the debt market is so enormous and the world is already saturated with dollars, and there's just not that much possibility for new dollar demand, because the vast majority of financial sector assets are essentially dollar-backed assets. On the other hand, the Bitcoin market is very small, and so small demands into Bitcoin will go up, and over time they're likely to maintain their value a lot better than their dollar reserves are going to do. So what we're having emerge right now is essentially, rather than being a way to boost the dollar, I think Tether is a good way to transition away from the dollar, because by putting some of their reserves into Bitcoin, they're allowing the world to access the dollar now, but they're allowing the world access to Bitcoin as well. Now add in the fact that by getting people to think about money in a digital way, by getting people to think about money in terms of private keys and public addresses, Tether is helping people think about Bitcoin. So the bottom line is that even the most bullish scenario for the US dollar, even the most imaginable way in which the US dollar's fate can be improved, is finding an enormous amount of bag holders all over the world to buy US dollar treasury shitcoins. And yet even that scenario is a lot more bullish for Bitcoin than it is for the US dollar. Ultimately, even a lot of buying of treasuries is likely going to be a lot more bullish for Bitcoin. It's going to make a lot more of a difference for Bitcoin, because of the fact that Tether is accumulating Bitcoin reserves, because it's smart for them to accumulate Bitcoin reserves, because this is the best way for them to protect against the devaluation and the likely default that might happen. So I don't really see this as being something that's going to boost the dollar. I don't think it can make enough of a difference in the dollar. And on the contrary, I think it's going to be more and more bullish for Bitcoin. Thank you very much for attending my talk. And if you're interested, I'll be selling and signing books at the exhibition stand. Thank you very much.